coffee break. Very bad on my part. So let's start this first session entitled "The State and the Body: Situated Analysis of Carceral Context." As we know, Daniel already told us, we are missing one participant, so that means more time for debate at the end. If everyone agrees, we'll leave the questions to the end, to debate to the end. Okay? So I'll present the first speaker, Professora Manuela Ivone Cunha. Has a PhD in anthropology and habilitation in sociology. Is a Portuguese senior research fellow at CRIA-UMinho and teaches at the University of Minho. Distinguished with the Social Science Award for ethnographic research on prisons, drug markets, and the penal management of inequality, she has also focused on informal economies, on emerging forms of vaccine refusal in Europe, and on intersections between criminal law, inequality, and cultural difference. She was Vice President of the European Association of Social Anthropologists and is currently the Editor-in-Chief of the journal Ethnographica. Recent publications include the Ethnography of Prisons and Penal Confinement in the Annual Review of Anthropology, number 43, Gypsy Economy, Romani Livelihoods and Notions of Work in the 21st Century, and Addressing Policy-Oriented Audiences, Relevance and Persuasiveness. It should be included in the volume, it should be called, Truth be Told, The Politics of Public Ethnography. So, I'll the word to Professor.
Good morning again. Sorry for reading, but I didn't sleep this night, so I really need papers more than ever. The imprisoned body is usually conceptualized as an object of disciplinary power, but it is not docile bodies or institutional power what I wish to address in this paper. I will focus on how prison sociality frames aspects of corporeality and how the body emerges as a key site for identity expression and social inscription. The sentient body is not a bounded entity containing the self, but a relational process. This means that not simply that mind and body are intertwined, but also that bodies are connected to other bodies and are permeable to them. I will develop these ideas by drawing on fieldwork conducted in 2 different decades inside the main women's prison in Portugal. In that time span, so it's with the decade interval, the prison population underwent several major changes. Not only it was almost multiplied by 5, but this sudden rise was accompanied by a penal and social homogenization. The overwhelming majority was imprisoned for drug-related offenses and was recruited from a few poverty-stricken urban neighborhoods. Prisoners were widely linked by pre-prison relations, both within internal and external networks of kin, friends, or neighbors. This created a continuity and a sort of synchronization between prison life and the life of the neighborhoods from which prisoners came from. The blurring of boundaries between the worlds behind and beyond bars also entailed the erosion of boundaries that had governed in prison life among prisoners a decade before. In the first decade, disqualifying co-inmates and establishing with them a social and symbolic distance was a way of dispelling the stigma attached to imprisonment. This negotiation of one's own stigma was expressed through the refusal to be leveled to an equal condition in a kind of distancing game by which any differences, for example, between types of offense, were amplified by prisoners themselves as a means of distancing or self-exclusion from the rest of the convict world. A prisoner could consider that her crime was a result of exceptional circumstances, whereas she would essentialize that of her companions as being a matter of a criminal nature. To be sure, a decade later, it became harder to invoke distinctions, to invoke differences. The previous variety of criminal categories gave way to the startling predominance of drug-related offenses. But if the previous game of mutual stigmatization a decade before created oppositions even within a same category of offenders, for example, between dealers and user dealers, now the prevailing tendency was to erase these differences. An almost all-inclusive category of identity emerges. We're all here for drugs, as prisoners say. This category absorbed not only drug dealing, but all kinds of drug-related offenses. For example, property offenses, larceny, fencing. But although the drug economy may appear in this designation as the common denominator, it does not by itself sustain this new category of collective agency and identity. This identity is also defined by a shared status at the bottom of the class structure and by a deep pre-prison stigma. Prison merely compounds the structural and symbolic marginalization that now collectively affected these populations. Stigma, contrary to what was the case a decade before, is no longer negotiable, and the previous game of mutual differentiation in prison became pointless. Secondly, the perception of a shared destiny and identity is also built on kin, friendship, and neighborhood ties. Several categories of representation, such as offense categories, for example, are now often already mixed within this circle of relationships in pre-prison life. For example, a non-user dealer with a non-dealer drug user husband and a drug user son who stole valuables at home to make some money. This conjunction is similar to and coherent with other combined circumstances in prison life. Confinement situations are prone to exacerbate fears of transmissible diseases as they involve forced cohabitation, joint participation in daily activities, and the common use of facilities and utensils. However, a decade earlier, the fear of contagion, especially by Hep B, HIV, was also used as a suitable means to reassert identity boundaries. It was, in any case, emphatically expressed by prisoners. Hygienic distancing, for example, outward rejection to sit on chairs used by co-prisoners, was based on the idea of a diffuse threat. Evil, as a prisoner put it, can come from anywhere. Evil, of course, was not only biological, it had a moral resonance. Concerns about intentional contamination were not uncommon. That is why even prisoners who, in the civilian world, did not believe in the non-segregation of infected people, now demanded separate prison units for several transmissible diseases. A decade later, this was no longer the case. This is all the more significant since the prevalence of the most feared transmissible problems had increased substantially. The proportion of HIV-positive prisoners, for instance, rose to around 20%, while 10 years before, the seroprevalence was almost the same as in the civilian population. Similarly, while self-mutilation barely existed in the past, it now became a daily occurrence. One would expect, then, a rise in demands for segregation among prisoners. But Contrary to that, the fears of contagion subsided instead of being exacerbated in a context that could potentiate them. Now, the precautions taken, when they are taken or they were taken, are strictly sanitary and have no moral content. I never heard a word or observed a behavior that might be interpreted as a distancing strategy. Instead, the former avoidance has been replaced by an opposite concern, that is, taking care not to threaten a prisoner's frail immune system with a cold, with a mycosis, for instance. Once again, prisoners are not unfamiliar with this reality before their imprisonment. A son, a brother, a neighborhood with AIDS or HIV. In this same decade, that is, in the second decade of my fieldwork, a small minority of prisoners of higher social standing, around 10% of the population, that is not included in the major category of identity that that I mentioned, the drugs, we're all here for drugs category, reproduced the same perceptions that governed prison sociality in the past, but at a very residual scale. Not incidentally, this minority of prisoners now use their personal tableware in order to, and I quote, protect themselves, and because, despite not questioning the prison tableware proper cleaning, they claimed to be disgusted at the thought of using the same as everybody's. The reasons for using personal utensils did not lie merely in the fear of physical contagion. They were part of a wider demarcation. These prisoners prefer to take their food in Tupperware containers from the refectory and eat their meal inside the cell to eat in the refectory with everybody else. This small minority were the same prisoners who claimed to feel deeply disturbed by prison noise. The sounds of doors, bolts, and bars, but above all, the voices. Not just any voices, but specifically the distressing reverberation caused by prison acoustics of voices perceived as, and I quote, underclass. These people are loud, it's in their blood. They can't keep their voices down, unquote. These prisoners also feel beset by smells, but again, not any smell. If I felt disturbed by the penetrating smell of manure from the prison farm, the leftovers and lunch boxes, the strong disinfectants shared on all premises, a discomfort that I share with most prisoners, this small minority of inmates, prisoners, complains mainly about the odor of the co-prisoners that I never smell. As one of them put it, it's this smell of people, of sweat, of drug addicts throwing up. It's a smell that gets into us. Smells detach themselves from bodies and cross boundaries. They are therefore suited to express ideas of contagion. It is no coincidence that in the 18th century, prisons became laboratories for the experimentation of ventilation, deodoration, and other sanitary techniques. The hygienist rationale was then bound with moral concerns and with the aim of preventing criminogenic contagion. As for these few socially better off prisoners, they are concerned with another type of contagion, that which dissolves boundaries between bodies, persons, and categories of people. So the aim was to secure distance, impermeability, and difference. But odors and smells, on the contrary, they homogenize and bring together. But just as prisoners ceased to be governed by the fear of contamination by pathogens, and, as I said, ceased to subsume this fear and a broader anxiety about the inherent impurity of co-prisoners, so too disturbing sounds and smells are not precisely denoted. That is, the discomfort they cause is not different from other sounds and smells. They are not endowed with a distinct meaning or rendered especially intolerable through the identification with certain people. So they are perceived as emanating, like all other sounds and smells, from the general physical environment of the prison. So, although prisoners are exposed to the same soundscapes and smellscapes, they don't experience them or talk about them in the same way. So the meaning of bodily experience is mediated by social relationships. This is all the more clear when we consider the importance of the body as the site of identity processes. While prisoners' identity in the past was structured by mutual opposition, as I mentioned, there was a close connection between the body and the individuated sense of the self. The acute awareness of corporeality ran parallel to the concern about the suppression of barriers between individuals. It was not only physical density that aroused perceptions of crowding and invasiveness of individual space. Permanent visual exposure to others was experienced as particularly intrusive. But in the second decade, however, cellmates are now often closely related, kin, friends. They are not perceived to threaten personal intimacy and integrity as dramatically as strangers. In any case, exposure to others ceased to be a topic in local talk. Undressing in front of others in the shower, refusing offerings from co-inmates, food items, or any kind of assistance is considered weird and distancing behavior, indicating that the person considers herself superior or different from the others. It elicits reproaches and is interpreted as a refusal to be absorbed into a community of equals. In the past, social detachment was the norm. Today, it became deviance. While previously prisoners were disturbed by signs of homogenization, today they are upset by signs of distinction. While the goal was to preserve difference, today it is to preserve sameness. Moreover, in the first decade, boundary setting was mostly inter-individual, and it was an attempt to resist a leveling convict status or identity. 10 years later, the few attempts at social demarcation were strongly class-related. Prisoners from the middle-class minority distanced themselves not so much from co-prisoners, but from, as they say, the neighborhoods or the project's crowd. This pre-prison class cleavage is indeed so deep that it overrides any intra-prison differentiation. And it is also inscribed on the body surface. Tattoos, for example. Tattoos render this social gap clearly visible. Convict bodies are decorated with a variety of iconographic motifs, but the same motif makes different things apparent. On one prisoner, a discrete fine-lined colored rose on the shoulder. On another, a wide and bold lined imperfect monochromatic rose on a more exposed area, an arm, a leg. This difference stems less from aesthetic preferences than technical and in part socioeconomic constraints. Contrary to professional tattoos, self-inflicted ones are more primitive and more exposed. They are also more painful, and they sometimes remain unfinished, incomplete names and images. This social divide also intersects with different gender practices. A middle-class prisoner who considered the bodies of co-inmates not only too visibly marked, but also contrary to her notions of femininity, commented that, and I quote, "It's so exposed and looks so bad in a woman." Then, with that on their arms, plus the scars from the self-cuttings, and then the hood crowd is surprised that they can't find a job. So the neighborhood crowd, that is the majority of prisoners, defines a prison category of collective agency and identity without parallel in the past. As I said, it is built through kin and neighborhood ties, as well as through class and the shared pre-prison social stigma. In a sense, it is a community expressed both in collective practices and representations. Besides practices of sharing and mutual assistance, including attending to newcomers under a drug abstinence syndrome, washing them, treating them, and feeding them, I found wide organized solidarity, contributions on behalf of destitute colleagues on the verge of leaving prison, petitions signed by 90% of prisoners protesting against unfair punishment of co-prisoners. A decade before, I had only witnessed two initiatives on a similar scale, but with an opposite meaning, such as demanding the disclosure of results for transmissible disease tests and the isolation of infected prisoners. Moreover, for the first time in the following decade, there was now a rhetoric of community, not only a practice, but also a rhetoric. For example, reiterated in expressions like, "We're all together in the same boat." The community was spontaneously asserted and not imposed by the total institution and experienced by prisoners as a threat. So bodily boundaries ceased to be patrolled. And just as previously prisoners, so a decade before, asserted their individuality with and through the body, later, a decade later, it was also with and through the body that the community was expressed. Episodes of prostration or paralysis known as attacks and attributed by prisoners to nerves can be interpreted in this light. These episodes in which a prisoner faints or falls inert, complaining of not feeling her legs or of losing strength, tended to occur in the past, so a decade before, after arguments with co-prisoners, guards, personnel. They were usually witnessed with relative indifference. The personnel dismissed them as hysterical, and co-inmates disdained them as attempts to draw attention. A decade later, although these phenomena continued to communicate personal distress, from time to time they also gained an expressive paracollective aspect. There were simultaneous attacks by several prisoners, an attunement of bodies expressing and performing an attunement of emotions. To give an example, there was a general outcry when it became known that a 34-year-old prisoner, mother of two, had re-entered prison with a 20-year prison sentence for drug trafficking, with little chance of applying for parole. When this was known, Some prisoners beat their chests with their hands, others cried, several fell or fainted. In this respect, it is, I think, irrelevant to try to sort out feelings of solidarity towards others from the perception that a colleague's misfortune today could easily turn onto one's own fate tomorrow. Either way, a sense of community is nevertheless expressed. So to conclude, social relations and categories structure how we sense and experience the world. The experience of confinement is not only shaped by institutional power, of course it is, by disciplinary devices, by ecological conditions. It is also mediated by prison sociality, and in part as a result of wider structural changes and changing forms of stigma beyond bars, the prison social landscape underwent a transformation that created new categories, new identifications, and subjectivities. It also reframed the way prisoners embody confinement. Embodiment is thus highly contextual. Corporeal barriers, identity boundaries, and separation gave way to aspects of relationality and connectedness. In the present, in the same way as in the past, the social, the symbolic, and the sensory orders intersect in the body and through the body, and they illuminate each other. Thank you.
Is Ines Hasselberg, okay, who is presenting Citizenship, Punishment and Mobility, the case of foreign nationals in prisons. Ines is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Research in Anthropology at the University of Minho. She completed her doctorate degree in anthropology at the University of Sussex in 2013, after which she held a postdoctoral position at the Center for Criminology at the University of Oxford. She has conducted extensive research on deportation, punishment, prisons, family life, and migrant surveillance. Her work is published in several international peer-reviewed journals such as Punishment and Society, Criminology and Criminal Justice, Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and Anthropology Today. She is the author of Enduring Uncertainty, Deportation, Punishment and Everyday Life, and co-editor of Deportation, Anxiety, Justice, New Ethnographic Perspectives.
Thank you. I'm well aware that I'm between you and lunch, so I'll try to be brief. I will also read because there's too many interesting things, and if I don't read, I end up spending my time in just providing the introduction to the subject. So, in this presentation, I will argue for the importance to see prison and the criminal justice system at large as sites of border control. And I will also talk a little bit about what this means for prisoners, but also what it means for us as researchers of the prison and punishment. I will be focusing on the experiences of foreign national prisoners in England and Wales. I will be drawing on my own field research in a prison in England, and it's a prison that is exclusive to foreign nationals. And this was the work that I developed in my previous postdoc at the University of Oxford. Now, the prison is an institution that is fundamentally rooted in the territory in which it is located, and traditionally it has been examined as such. But we live today in an age of globalization and of increasing mobility, and penal institutions should no longer be examined as exclusively bounded to the nation-state. Instead, today, we should be looking at prisons through a lens that goes beyond the prison wall and beyond the nation-state. Because at the same time that people are becoming more mobile, states are developing efforts to reduce people's access to their territory. These developments are influential, not just in how imprisonment is experienced, but also in how nationality impacts on what happens after imprisonment. So in England today, confinement and supervision of foreign national offenders is no longer restricted to their criminal sentences. The development of immigration policies that broaden eligibility to deportation and allow easier removal of unwanted foreign nationals has meant, among other things, that the prison is increasingly used as a tool of border control. Now, crime and immigration are two areas of great political sensitivity in the UK and elsewhere in the world. In the past decade, there has been a series of changes in immigration law and policy. Today, broadly speaking, in England and Wales, what we have are automatic deportations for foreign nationals convicted of criminal offences. What this means is that any foreign national convicted to a 12-month sentence or more of imprisonment is now automatically served with a deportation order. So in the example that Ruth was giving to Danielle, like you can either sign this and go to prison for 18 months, or if you lose trial, you go to prison for 5 years. Prisoners in England now have to consider that a guilty plea will imply a deportation order. So they will not just serve 18 months of sentence. After the sentence, they will be detained in immigration detention centers, and then they'll be expelled of the country with a ban to return, so they cannot return. There has also been an increasing interdependence between the UK Border Agency and the prison services in the management of foreign national prisoners. And this has meant a restructuring of the whole penal estate in order to facilitate the deportation of foreign nationals. Among other things, this has meant the segregation of prisoners according to their citizenship. Now, immigration legislation in the UK is very complex, it's always changing. But what this means is that once they finish their sentence, foreign nationals may be detained in prison or in an immigration removal sentence while their deportation files are being processed. The deportation can be appealed at an immigration tribunal on human rights grounds, most often on Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which is the right to respect for family and private life. Now, this increasing punitive turn towards foreigners is not particular to the UK, and statistical accounts tell us that a growing number of foreign national prisoners are incarcerated throughout Europe, North America, and elsewhere. Across Europe, foreign nationals account for an average of 20% of the incarcerated population. In some countries, however, as you can see in this chart, this percentage is far higher, and what you see in Switzerland, Luxembourg, Greece, and Austria, and there's others, I just put these as examples, is that foreign nationals make up more than half of the confined population. In the UK, the figures from 2014, this was around the time that I did fieldwork, show that foreign nationals make up 12% of the overall population, and the most common nationalities are Polish, Irish, Jamaican, Romanian, and Pakistani. Now, it's also important to notice that foreign nationals are more likely to be imprisoned on remand while awaiting trial and sentencing, tend to be given longer custodial sentences, be refused recategorization to open conditions, tend to be detained after sentence under immigration powers, and refused bail from immigration detention on account of their previous conviction. And what this means is that foreign nationals are actually liable to spend more time confined than British citizens. For scholars of prison studies today, what this means is that they're likely to encounter a large number of foreign nationals while they're collecting data in or of prison. This particular group may or may not have a different perception and experience of the issue at hand, be that prisoner-staff relations, health, recidivism, whatever that you're studying. Yet, on account of language and other social and cultural barriers, foreign nationals are often excluded altogether from research samples. Conducting research in prison is always ethically demanding. Confinement draws into question issues of informed consent and confidentiality. Research with foreign national prisoners raises additional ethical concerns. This group of prisoners may have experienced or witnessed traumatic events either in their country of origin or in their migration journeys. If they are known to immigration authorities, they are likely to have been interrogated on multiple occasions, not just on account of their criminal conviction, but also on account of their immigration circumstances. Qualitative research will mean submitting them to yet another round of questions, asking them to once again retell their stories. There are also issues of access. Language barriers are, of course, an important obstacle, but also to what extent are foreign national prisoners facing deportation more or less inclined to participate in academic research? And how can we make sense of their behavior and accounts when so much is at stake? And Carolina Bow has an article on this issue that is particularly interesting. However, all of this is not limited to prisoners' experiences. The nationality of prisoners has also become increasingly important in England to how prisons actually operate. Because of the automatic deportation regime that I mentioned earlier, prisons now have the added responsibility of determining citizenship, notifying immigration authorities, and holding under immigration powers an increasing number of foreign nationals after the end of their sentences. Again, these developments are not particular to the UK. Both UK and Norway, for example, have built facilities exclusive to foreign national prisoners. These are argued to be better able to provide cultural support and offer classes in English as a second language, while at the same time facilitating and expediting the work of immigration enforcement in removing those who are considered deportable. The downside, however, is that segregating prisoners according to nationality may actually undermine the quality of care and support provided to foreign nationals in preventing full access to the same range of rehabilitation and reintegration initiatives that are available to citizen prisoners. Now, it was in one such prison, Her Majesty Prison Huntercombe, that I conducted fieldwork. My project was called the Post-Colonial Prison, Citizenship, Punishment and Mobility, and it intended to gain a better understanding of the experiences of foreigners in prison in order to discuss the relevance of citizenship and migration in our understanding, in our way of understanding imprisonment and punishment. Between September and December 2013, I spent most of my work time in this facility, talking to and interviewing both staff and prisoners and observing the daily life of prison. Huntercombe is a category C and D prison. This means this is a low security prison that already offers for category D prisoners open conditions so they can go outside and work and come back in the evening. It's also a prison that is exclusive to foreign nationals who are serving their sentences there. It has a capacity to hold 430 prisoners. It's a training prison, which means that prisoners spend a larger part of their days engaging in vocational training, and vocational training is mandatory. If they refuse to do the training, they will lose privileges. Now, as a prison exclusive to foreign nationals, Huntercombe has the added duties of expediting the removal process and detaining post-sentence many of its prisoners, as I've mentioned earlier. Now, while the difference in rights and entitlements available to former citizens as opposed to long-term legal residents are in practice and in daily life quite negligible, in the event of a criminal conviction, this distinction of citizenship becomes very, very important. In Huntercombe, prisoners felt less defined in relation to their own citizenship than to that which they did not have, the British citizenship. Finding themselves in a prison that's exclusive to foreigners added to their sense of vulnerability. They felt targeted and discriminated against. A prison dedicated solely to foreigners resonated in them images of ghettos and concentration camps, a form of segregation that at the very least made them feel very uneasy. Prisoners were well aware that they were serving time at that particular establishment only because they were non-British. They also felt that everything at Huntercombe was designed to lead them to return voluntarily to their countries of origin. For instance, education and vocational training activities were developed in accordance to the perceived needs of foreign nationals. As such, on offer were the vocational training programs sought to be of use for reintegration of foreign nationals in their country of origin and not in the UK, with emphasis always given to blue-collar skills, information and communication technology, and business enterprise. Prisons felt, again, the constant pressure to agree to voluntary return. This was manifested, for instance, in the spread belief that only those agreeing to return voluntarily to their country of origin were granted recategorization to semi-open conditions. Although I didn't really find any such correlation, this common perception works to make prisoners feel punished for being foreigners and wanting to stay in the UK. Furthermore, because this rejection was most commonly justified by a possible interest that immigration authorities might have in the prisoner, it only served to exacerbate feelings of anti-foreigner discrimination. The difficulties in obtaining access to open conditions and being detained post-sentence were the two main grievances that prisoners had against the system, and both of them pertain to extended periods of incarceration. Prisoners also felt that the system was designed to jeopardize possible deportation appeal cases. This was so on the difficulties that they face in obtaining many of the documents that they need to present for their appeals, which they claimed were very easily accessible in other prisons. But also on the very fact that for most of them, being sent to Huntercombe meant that they were serving their sentence at a very large distance from their family's residence. This meant that they didn't really have that many family visits, which affected not only their emotional well-being and sense of self, but also hindered their chances of appealing deportation on Article 8 grounds, that's the right to respect for private and family life, because it becomes more difficult for them to prove the existence of family life. So one of the things that they need to show in court is the slips of the family visiting the prison. So if there's no family visiting the prison, there's no slips, they cannot prove that family life continues. This means that the ever-growing presence of immigration enforcement within the prison system is changing how the experience of incarceration is felt. Those wanting to stay in the UK felt that they were being denied the rehabilitation element of their incarceration, as most training activities were not suitable for them. But there were other changing elements. Prisoners at Huntercombe may know very well how much sentence time they have left to serve, but they also know better than to expect to be released when it ends. The expectation of continued confinement upon the end of the sentence was very pronounced at Huntercombe. Prisoners see others remaining incarcerated there post-sentence or being transferred to a detention center, so they don't really know when they will leave prison. Sentence time becomes characterized by uncertainty. Nuno, for instance, was constantly on edge in the week leading up to the end of his sentence. He tried not to be hopeful for release, but as the day approached and there was no order to detain him past his sentence, hope started to grow. Every day after work, he would march straight to his prison officer to check whether an order had arrived or not. And every day, having no post, was a short-lived relief that was soon overtaken by anxiety and uncertainty. In the end, Nuno was served with the order of his detention on his actual day of release, after he had packed his bags and said his farewells. He was devastated, and so was his family, who were waiting for him at the gate. But mostly he was frustrated that he had allowed himself to hope after all he had seen at Huntercombe. Nuno, like all of the prisoners held at Huntercombe post-sentence and under immigration powers, had to waive his rights as a detainee, because Huntercombe does not have the capacity to fulfill these rights. What this means, for instance, is that if you're an immigration detainee, you are allowed to have a mobile phone, and you can have indeterminate visits time. Because Huntercombe does not have the facilities and the structure to facilitate these rights, they have to waive the rights as detainees. So most of those detained in prison wished to be taken to a detention center upon the end of their sentence. But this was so not only because in detention centers they would have a larger pool of benefits, but also simply because they were no longer prisoners. This was a point of importance in how post-sentence time was spent in prison. In my very first day of research at Huntercombe, one prisoner told me this: when we finish our sentence, we are no longer prisoners. We are civilians. We should not be kept in prison. We should be taken to detention. This statement provides some clue over the importance of being treated as a civilian and of prisoners' efforts in contesting that their deportation is in the best interest of the public good. But perhaps most importantly and disconcerting, this statement is revealing of how imprisonment is experienced differently by this particular segment of the prison population. Foreign national prisoners perceive only two possibilities upon the end of their sentences. Both of these possibilities are outside of their control, and neither of them means integration into the community. They can remain in prison as an immigration detainee or be transferred to an immigration detention center. It is especially telling that prisoners at Huntercombe no longer hope, let alone expect, to be released to society upon the end of their sentences. Now, this raises important questions about the intersection of border control and penalty in the UK, including the ways in which the traditional purposes of punishment and the rationale for rehabilitation are changing as the practices of imprisonment and deportation become ever more interdependent. So, in a very quick manner, I have tried here to show how the current interdependence between border control and penalty is changing how prisons operate, and how citizenship today impacts not just the experience of imprisonment, but also impacts on prisoners' identities, sense of self, and sense of worth. For us researchers, the increasing number of foreign nationals in prison raise further ethical and methodological challenges, some of which I have pointed out earlier. When taken together, these points raise important questions to be considered. Some of these questions include: what becomes of rehabilitation when prisoners are prepared for deportation and not release? What is punishment when a criminal conviction includes more than one kind of incarceration? And where exactly is punishment location when a prison sentence may lead to deportation? Who is administering the penalty and to what end? I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Debate is now open. Any questions?
Thanks, Bob, for your presentation. I have a question for you. Sim. I have a question for Ines, actually. When you compare those data about the representation of foreign nationals in prisons, well, actually, I was surprised by the very low percentage in the UK as compared to other countries. And that made me think, because in the UK there is not less foreigners than, say, in Italy, where I think almost half of the prison population now is foreign. So there's two things. One is, if we agree that the prison system is a racialized system, so does this mean that we have different ways racialization works in different contexts? And maybe in the Anglo context it's less about immigration and more about more ancient histories, such slavery and so forth. And second, what does this mean about the prisons? Because this prison you described, in a way, is an exception. It's not a normality. Mm-hmm. We don't have, well, maybe in the UK, I don't think there is this kind of prisons for foreign nationals in Southern Europe, for instance. And the system works differently. In Southern Europe, it's important you have foreign nationals within prisons to keep the system going. So is that an Anglo-English exception or not?
Hang on, let me try and get that. Oh, no, it's... There are very different reasons why some countries like Switzerland and Luxembourg have very high percentage of foreign nationals in prison. And part of the reasons are related to nationality law. So some countries allow for foreign nationals to become citizens much easier than others. So in Switzerland, it's very, very difficult for a foreign national to become a citizen, which means that most of the foreign-born population becomes foreign national, never gets nationalized. There's also the issue that explains these differences of what is considered an immigration crime or offense. So traditionally you have a whole bunch of immigration offenses that were not punishable with custodial sentence. But now in the past decade, there has been the range of immigration offenses that are punished by custodial sentences has increased really a lot. With Greece and Italy, a lot of the numbers are explained by the destitution of asylum seekers as well, which then leads to other sorts of types. In England, yeah, it is between 12 to 14%, depending on the years. Portugal is about 20. I'm not sure how much. I mean, I know whether this is an exception. Yeah, I mean, I think I also did field work for this project in a prison in Portugal, in Minho. And it is a very, very different context. And I think part of the difference is the emphasis that England is giving to not just immigration policy, but immigration enforcement. So they're very keen on enforcing all immigration policies that they're getting through. And so the Home Office is constantly, bragging about all these new targets of people that have been that have been deported and removed from the country. Is a very hot issue. Immigration was one of the issues with Brexit, and so they have all these policies, and they have. Hunter Combe at the time was the only foreign national prisoner in England when I did the research. They now have at least 2 more. Norway has opened one as well, and I think Holland, the Netherlands, were opening prisons as well, exclusive to foreign nationals. So, yeah. But yeah. They are very close, actually. It was Maidstone, which is, Hunter Combe is in Oxfordshire, so it's about 40 minutes drive from Oxford. Maidstone, I think it's about 1 hour away from Oxford as well. And the other one, I don't remember what it is, but it's also in England. It's not in Scotland. It's also in the southern part. Well, most of them are not U complexes. They are prisons that have just re-rolled as exclusive. So they were already existed, but now they only cater for foreign nationals.
I think I saw a raised hand over there.
Hi, my question is to Ivone. And as far as I understood from your readings and from your presentation of today, I would like to grab the idea of we are all together in the same boat. And as far as I understood from other readings from you and from your presentation of today, are you understand me?
Yes, I think.
I believe that you believe that there is a kind of social harmony inside the prison, taking into account the testimonies of the female inmates, saying that the common situation of being confined were more prevalent than other filters that could divide them in terms of social relationships. And as far as I am seeing during my research, as I found in Funchal prison with foreigners, the more and more I understand that they put lots of symbolic demarcations amongst each others. In terms of religion, linguistic sharing, in terms of the ways that they express about their belongings, and it's quite important to them to make their ethnic and racial demarcations between them. And even when I work in a tiered prison, when you have made your research, they express a lot of tension towards the Portuguese and Cape Verdeans, and so I would like to understand better if you see the prison as that harmonization that I was saying in terms of the social dynamics.
Okay. So. Forgive me if I'm not very clear, but 2 things. First, the word harmony is not at all, does not represent what went on in this second decade in my fieldwork in this same prison. What I want to say is not that, let's say, there was as much conflict among prisoners in the second decade than in the first one, but there were different kinds of conflicts. That is the same for different reasons. They had nothing to do with identity in the second. It is also important that, well, there were practices of solidarity that did not exist at the same scale in my first fieldwork, but most of all there was this rhetoric, the way prisoners talked about their social world and the moral world, which was completely different. Even if there were conflicts and sometimes violent conflicts, but they were not the identitarian kind, you know. So this is one thing. The word is not harmony. It's the way on a collective, large scale, what goes on for which reasons, and the way they see and talk about their own collective world. It was very different. So this is one to better characterize what I wanted to say. The second thing is that what I talked about, I didn't explain because I didn't have much time. I was lucky to, I think, witness two extreme forms in two moments. And they were very useful to make a theoretical point, because when things are extreme, you can see better what goes on and why. What are the factors involved in this configuration? Nowadays, I know that in most prison contexts, the scenario is more mitigated. You know, you can find strands of each model or each ideal type that in these two different decades were empirical realities, really. And now they are more mixed up, you know, they're more balanced. So you are totally right. Now for example, in the late 90s, this small percentage of prisoners corresponded or reproduced what was before the situation for the majority of, and now I think things are much more balanced, and so it makes total sense what you are saying.
Thank you very much for both the presentation. My question is for both, mainly for Ines, maybe, but my question is about how broader, methodologically, how broader we should go to understand what's going on inside prisons. Both of you said we need to go beyond the walls, at least. But my question is more precise. I think we as sociologists, we take social services, social tasks, social support as something at sometimes alike security measures. For instance, when we talk about reintegration inside prisons or rehabilitation inside prisons, for me, is more or less like equalizing social work, like education, for instance, with the security measures. I don't have too much time to undo it. But reintegration inside prison calls adaptation to prisons, not reintegration in society. And this question is not very clear for many people, at least, working on social sciences. And at the reverse side, the work outside prisons, the social work outside prisons, for instance, in the neighborhoods where people go to prison, is not the social work reserved to control immigrants. Is not. Maybe should be better looked at as part of an whole system, to an whole state system. For instance, when Manuela Ivone called attention to the two big different culture inside prisons, you talk about female prisons. I don't have any anthropological work inside prisons, but I heard prisons, male prisons, to talk about the same thing. So I presume you are talking about something that is real. I'm asking myself if these kind of differences has nothing to do with the growing activity, social activity from the states, from the autarkias, from the cities, inside the neighborhoods, to draw attention, for instance, for drug dealing, because it was a big problem, as you know, in the 90s in Lisbon. Absolutely. It was the biggest open supermarket, and it has a big political issue about it.
Of course.
And a lot of working social works have been done. What kind of relationship we have between these two kinds of work, security measures and social measures, in order to do something about this kind of people who are different from the others. They don't have not security measures, not social measures. So my question is a bit methodological one. If you feel we need to go broader than our speciality that is looking for in prisons, inside prisons, and how can we do it? If you have some thoughts about it, of course. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I know.
First.
I don't know if I want to, because I think there were several questions. And I don't know. Well, I could answer in a lot of different directions, but in a very practical manner. I usually, of course, you have to have a theoretical framework to start with, of course. But it is very useful to follow people's lives very attentively. If you follow, that solves the problem. You talked about the scales. At what point do you open the scales? Well, you just follow people's lives very attentively, and they lead us where things are connected. The same thing with social work, security measures, all that. How does that interconnect in very concrete trajectories in time and the relationship between? And so if it's a methodological question, that's how I try to do it.
Thank you both for really interesting talk. So I have kind of the same question for both of you. Why did the change that you just told us about is such an interesting about this man happen? What happened to make this happen? What provoked this shift? In your case, because of what you said, Manuela and Ines, why did it change in that particular way? And I kind of mean like
I mean, in very sort of pragmatic terms, in the UK, what changed was there was in 2006 a very large scandal where it came to the attention of the news that I think it was almost 200 offenders, so foreign nationals who had served their time in prison, had been released back to society after their sentences. Now, this was a big scandal because one of these foreign prisoners went on and raped yet another girl. So it was such a huge scandal that the Home Secretary resigned, and it led to, at the time, the border agency was dismantled. They restructured the whole border, the way the whole border issue was managed. Borders were managed and institutionalized. And that's when they started with the automatic deportations, when they started having the targets, the annual targets for the deportation of foreign nationals, which before they only had for failed asylum seekers. And that's when they started also to have this prison system where they start segregating prisoners who are foreigners from those who are citizens. And so ever since then, which has been a decade now, it's, the system has grew more and more asphyxiating for foreigners who have committed offences. And most of them are people who have been living in the UK for a long time, who could have very easily filed in for nationality, but they never did because they never needed, because for every purpose in their lives, they were treated as a citizen. And then these changes came and everything changed. And it's becoming worse and worse. So every year they keep on expanding the range of immigration offences. They're punished with custodial sentences. So it's becoming more and more strict. I'm not sure.
It's so similar to the United States. And breathtaking. It's shocking to me, but it's still the similarity. The United States is becoming longer. And in the federal level, the prisons are called criminal alien requirement. Imagine
So I just selected these two moments because they were, just to make my theoretical point, they were the most striking extremes. And what went on between those 2 decades, late 80s and late 90s, the immediate causes, if you wish, they laid in 2 things. One was the way the local retail drug economy worked in Portugal, but the other one, and the main one, was the way drug laws were enforced by the police that were really targeting specific neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods and minorities. And there is much more selectivity and bias when there is this collective targeting of certain territories and minorities. So one way, the way the police worked, and the other way, the way courts enforced drug laws, which were very harsh. So there was this boom on the one hand, lots of people going to jail, who came from the same targeted neighborhoods. So I will not go to the drug economy because that would take a while. Afterwards, we had a change in not only in drug laws. It was not only the decriminalization of drug use and possession that was in 2001-2, that had very little impact in prison rates. But what had a very positive impact in prison rates was a prison reform that first was directed at prison practices, but actually there was a series of recommendations that were directed at courts, the way courts applied drug laws. And there was then prison rates went down, and then there was austerity. Then there was austerity, and it started to climb again for several reasons that were not as directly connected to drug laws and enforcement as was before. There was a whole series of other laws, and structural, really, for example, fines. The fines went up, and the people's ability to pay the fines were so. This was just a small example, but there were lots of things happening. Now it's starting to. It's very soon to say, but it's very interesting to follow these cycles and try to see the big picture with a bit of distancing, to. Sorry.
It's just an observation, because I found it interesting the fact that there is there is an uncertainty about the length of the detention, uncertainty is the main stressor. So in this context, are very serious conditions, are very similar. And I also descended of the prison who say that go to a detention center instead prison because he doesn't want to prison. But it's an illusion because in detention people feel criminals without a reason. Some say that they prefer prison because in prison they have a reason to be in prison. And it's like a vicious circle because the main goal is deportation. Yeah, criminals without a real reason, just because they are criminals. So they prefer treat like criminals because they have committed a crime. So it's interesting.
I think in the UK, detention is particularly characterized by uncertainty because the UK did not subscribe to the European limit of 18 months. So they don't even have those 18 months to kind of see. So there's people who spend like 3-4 years in detention. The prison versus detention, I mean, I did my PhD on offenders who had already left prison. So they finished their sentence, they were in the community, but they were appealing their deportation. So they were going through the tribunal and everything. And they kept on being taken to detention. They would spend a few weeks there, and then they managed to get bail, and then they would get out, and then again and again. And it was always very uncertain how long they would be. And when I did my PhD, all my research participants would say, like, detention is the worst because you have nothing to do. In prison, at least you have, work or vocational training. And, they would say, yes, conditions in detention are so much better. You have TV in your bedroom, you can have, the PlayStation, you can have a mobile phone, you can walk around as you please. But at the end of the day, you have nothing to do. And you don't know when you're going to leave. And that's it breaks you, not knowing where you're going to leave and not understanding why you're there. When you're a prisoner, you know why you're there. You may not agree with your sentence. You may have been found guilty and are actually innocent, but at least you know that this is how society works. If you're considered guilty of a crime, you go to prison. So that's sort of expected. I think here what happens is that being a detainee in prison, it's the worst of the two worlds. So it's even worse than being a foreign criminal or a foreign offender taken to immigration detention. If you're still in prison post-sentence, you don't have rehabilitation, you don't have access to any of the rehabilitation activities because you're no longer a prisoner, you're a detainee, but you don't have access to any of the privileges of being a detainee, like visits or walking around as you please or a mobile phone to talk to your family. So actually being a detainee in prison, it's pretty much like the worst of the two worlds. And I think that's what they meant here, and also the fact that they finish their sentence, they pay their debt to society. They are civilians.
One last question.
My question to Manuela, in your answer to Professor Wilson, you gave all factors you enumerate are exterior to the prisoner themselves. Police, reform, law. Is this don't contradict your main argument that the control and disciplinary devices are are not affecting strongly the sociability of the prisoner themselves, and putting forward the sociability, internal sociability, as the main factor of this change?
I didn't. I did not say that it did not affect prisoner sociality. It does. But I wanted to look and to point other things that affect that sociality beyond the, because usually when you, well, I read this call for papers and I saw body embodiment, so and so usually when you talk about bodies and prisons and prisoners, usually it's analyzed through the control, the total institution, the disciplinary power, the docile bodies, etc. What prison and the state do to bodies, and that is absolutely true. But it's not the only thing. You have to look. There are other things too. So that's what I wanted to bring to attention.
My question to Ines. Did you find some of that historical community practice of solidarity also among foreign national prisoners, or the difference of nationalities are an obstacle to this?
That's it's both a yes and a no. I mean, things are never black and white. For the most part, what you see when you go into Huntercombe is that you start seeing nationality groups. So from an outsider, what you see is that these guys look very South Asian, this group here, and this group here looks very Caribbean, and this group there looks very Asian, Vietnamese, or something. But then when you actually look closer, it's not necessarily like that. And they may hang around more with people from their countries of origin for all sorts of cultural reasons, but also because most of the times they also come from the same neighborhood in London or in Sheffield or whatever it is that they live. So I found, yes, that there was stereotyping of nationalities by both prisoners and officers, but everyone just, yeah, I wouldn't say there was necessarily great segregation either between the different nationalities. There were games where everyone played together, games organized by the prisoners themselves. So there were other kinds of identities. So nationality is a very strong identity, but also like age groups, senior prisoners tended to be among themselves. Religious groups, so the Muslims stick together for all sorts of reasons as well, which kind of cross-cut between different nationalities. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Okay, so I'd like to thank our speakers and the audience for having created such a